Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Fury of Dracula video, and perhaps the most important video on my channel to date. There's no gameplay in this one, as we'll be geeking out over some numbers instead. This video has definitely been a bit of a daunting task to make, and one that is very much long overdue, but the fact it's the start of a new year, well, we're now in February, so I've kind of missed that, but never mind. It's a new year, and I recently realised that we'd played over 1,000 games as a community across all of the tournaments to date. It felt like a momentous occasion and the right time to finally do this and get this video out for you. You're also getting two videos for the price of one, as 1 hour after this video goes live, another video called The State of the Game in 2026 will be on the channel. The one you're watching right now will deal with the raw numbers and data mostly in an objective manner, hopefully. And then this other one will be my more sort of subjective ramblings on how I feel about the game and possible house rules moving forward. Either way, please feel free to get involved with the conversation in the comments and in the Discord. Speaking of the Discord, a quick introduction in case you don't know me. I'm Scott Sword, one of the members of the Fury of Dracula Digital Edition community through the Discord server hosted by Nomad Games, the link to which you'll find in the main menu of the game or in the description of this video. I've been there since February 2022, and in the second half of that year, I organised the very first Fury of Dracula Digital Edition tournament. Since then, I, with some wonderful help, have run 7 more tournaments through a dedicated Discord server that I created, a link to which you'll also find in the video description. I created that separate Discord server because I soon realised we would need the extra space. But we still use the Nomad Discord server for finding friendly games and for chatting to the developers. Even though they are busy on other projects, they do engage with us. Before we go into the stats, I'll provide a little bit of background so that we're all on the same page, especially to those who are not members of the community who might be watching this. To date, we have run 8 tournaments in the community. Our flagship tournament, the League of Dracula, has run in the second half of the last 4 years, firstly starting off with a multiple stage round-robin league format before evolving into a mixed league and knockout format. In the first half of the last 3 years, we have run other tournaments which have been either shorter or have incorporated different formats. The Spring Regionals Tournament in 2023 saw the European and American participants split into different round-robin leagues. New Blood was a tournament restricted to newcomers and previous participants who hadn't reached the latter stages of previous tournaments. The Immortal Invitational saw the players' individual results contribute to a team ranking. And lastly, Duos and Dark Calls was the same as the Immortal Invitational, but with the inclusion of a variant to the Dark Call power card that's in the game. In all the tournaments to date, all games have been played 1v1. In other words, one person controls all 4 hunters and one player controls Dracula. While we sometimes play 2, 3 or 4 players controlling hunters in friendly games, we only ever expect 1v1 games for tournaments, at least up to now, due to the commitment required to organise them whilst coordinating around different schedules and time zones, as well as not unintentionally prohibiting people who don't feel comfortable talking in a second language or who have speech or hearing impairments. In addition, with the exception of the Immortal Invitational and Duos and Dark Calls, players were expected to play more or less the same number of games on either side of the board, so that the winning player will hopefully will be the one that can show sufficient ability on both factions. And if there is an inherent imbalance between the two sides, Hunters and Dracula, everyone has the possibility to benefit. All games have been played on the Digital Edition PC or mobile application for Fury of Dracula, which is aligned most closely to the 4th edition of the physical board game. Furthermore, all games have been played with advanced rules, so that's rumor tokens, layers, power cards, and free placement switched on. A key date for the community was the spring of 2024, as this was when the Immortal update arrived. This update, born through the collaboration between Nomad Games and the community, provided many quality of life improvements and bug fixes to the game. While these changes might not have necessarily affected win rate and that sort of thing, there were also 4 key rules that were altered, bringing the digital edition even more in line with the 4th edition of the physical board game. And I'll go through them with you, just so you know them. The first allowed Dracula to see his encounter hand prior to choosing his first location. I wrote this script not looking at my slides. That's very good. Anyway, so yeah, Dracula can now see his encounter hand prior to choosing his first location, providing more strategic decision making. Another big change, written here at the top, was that the order of Dracula's trail sliding relative to his choosing of a new location. The default rule of the digital edition was, and still is, that Dracula's trail slides after he chooses a new location. But a house rule was implemented that means the order is reversed. This effectively reduces the cooldown of power cards by one movement phase, as well as providing Dracula with more movement options by clearing cities and sea spaces a turn earlier, and being able to base his movement upon any mature effects that might happen. To the hunter's benefit, the combat information screen was changed so that it did not distinguish between combat and non-combat item cards being held by each hunter, thus meaning Dracula could not deduce as much information about hunter items until they were actually used in combat or not. And lastly, the implementation of Forewarned was changed so that the ambushed hunter, i.e. the one entering the city, could be the one to use Forewarned, rather than any hunter on the city space, therefore providing a buff to Dracula's encounters, a natural fog, wolves, and cigar neat mob, which also ended up in a lot of bluffing tactics from both sides. To be clear, these changes in the Immortal Update were not done in any way to favour one side or the other, but to provide a digital edition that was more representative of the physical game it is based on. I'll deviate from my script here slightly and say that if you want to find out more about the Immortal Update, I actually recorded a video with Tom the Ancient One, who is the marketing representative for Nomad Games, and also Eridra, who's one of the developers at Nomad Games, who worked on the Immortal Update. We had a long video where we discussed all the different changes, and they discussed, we discussed the reasoning behind a lot of the changes too. So if you're interested in that, do check it out after this one. Okay, the last bit of background to discuss is that inside our community there is a clear meta, especially for the hunter side, that has developed. This involves hunters prioritizing supplying over movement in the first week, and this has been coined dig, don't dash. While this does allow Dracula days of planning and being able to develop his trail, it results in strongly equipped hunters in terms of items and events. Hunters are also highly discouraged from night supplying due to the power of Dracula events, so this results in a very low number of Dracula events being played and being seen, at least in competitive play. A key part of the meta as well is the use of fast horses and the hunters holding on to non-yellow 2 value train tickets, which results in highly efficient and flexible movement. Even though individual hunter combat strength is reduced by holding on to fast horses, because it takes up a valuable item slot, they are more likely to achieve multi-hunter combats versus Dracula, as well as being more efficient trail clearers. Just to be clear, this is purely a meta, a proven efficient way to play, but there is no hard rule on the game being played this way, and players in the community will often experiment with different setups. It's just a normal fact that inside an active community, a consensus will be reached over certain aspects of play, especially with the sheer number of people in the community who now record their games for everyone to analyze and learn from. Right. Let's get on to the stats. Let's talk about win rate first. I'm sure you're all chomping at the bit to know which side is stronger. Well, let's see. With a total of 1,003 tournament games played, the Hunters have won 501 and Dracula has won 502. So as you can see, 50% for both sides. The game is perfectly balanced. Nothing more to discuss. Thanks for watching, everybody. Okay, I jest. There's plenty more to discuss. But I must admit, I did almost fall out of my chair when I saw that the total wins was so close to 50% for each faction. So the headline win rate shows the game is very close to being balanced. But let's see if there's any devils hiding in the detail with this one. A look at the win rate across all the different tournaments shows that the win rate does vary a bit, but with a high of only 55% for one side or the other. There is an interesting trend, though, that Dracula had a higher win rate initially, but with it then trending towards the Hunters until the Immortal Update, that's what this dashed line is, And then the cycle repeated. Dracula had the win rate advantage, and now it's trended towards the Hunters again, even more so than before. The flip in win rate between the League of Dracula of 2024 and the Duo and Dark Horse tournament, which took place in the first half of 2025, is quite notable. Let's put it that way. I don't know if this trend in win rate is just purely coincidence. It's definitely interesting. It's something we can keep an eye on moving forward. Will the Hunter win rate keep trending upwards, or will it plateau, or even will it swing back in the opposite direction if we don't change anything? We'll have to see. For the first graph that I'll show you, I must give credit to two community members. Firstly, to Randiv, who initially brought up this topic, and if I even recall correctly, I think did the necessary calculations after the first league in 2022. And also secondly to R2Win, who encouraged me to make this very specific graph I'm going to show you. While the overall win rate for the two sides is equal, is there a discrepancy in faction win rate when player skill or ranking is considered? Therefore, what I have done is calculate for every tournament participant across all the tournaments, except for the two team-based ones, their win rate for each faction separately per tournament. So for example, if I was a tournament participant, I would separate my total win rate into my win rate for Hunters and for Dracula. And then if I participated in multiple tournaments, then I'd have a different win rate for each faction for every tournament I participated in. And then I plotted all the win rates against the percentile that the player occupies. So in other words, if a Hunter player's percentile is 80%, then they're in the top 20% of Hunter players based upon their win rate. And here's the graph. So the red curve represents Dracula, naturally, and the grey curve is for the Hunters. So we've got the percentile on the x-axis, win rate on the y-axis. So we can see that there's sort of 3 or 4 distinct portions of this graph. So at low percentiles, so lower skill level, lower experience, low win rate, we can see that Dracula has the advantage in terms of win rate. This is most likely due to the imbalance in the skill floor of the two factions. The Hunters have a steeper learning curve, especially in a 1v1 setting in which the player has to control all 4 Hunters at once and remember all the items and the events, and also potentially the player might be somebody who's new to the community and they're adapting and adjusting to the meta, the various event combinations, and also the danger that Dracula can pose if the Hunters are not well equipped. As the players on either side of the board gain experience with the meta and the capabilities of not only their side, but the other side too, they're able to win more games, and the gap in win rate closes a bit. The middle section of the graph, just look at that overlap. Really nice overlap. This is what we want to see, right? This overlap extends between the 50%, more or less, and 75% percentile, corresponding to a win rate of 50 to 60%. Players in this range will have close games between each other and also be able to take advantage of less experienced players and might well push highly skilled players to the limit but come up short in the end. The section involving the highest percentile players shows the opposite to the lowest percentiles. The Hunters having the win rate advantage, and even there are a couple of examples of them having 100% win rate, whereas Dracula players have never reached this win rate value. Just in case anyone was wondering, the Hunter players who achieved this 100% win rate did so despite playing several games inside the tournament. It's not as if they'd only played 1 or 2 games to get a 100% win rate. This disparity can be explained, we presume, by the discrepancy in the skill ceiling of the two factions. The Hunters are only limited by the player's sheer ability and knowledge of the event combinations, and also make sure they supply enough to get those events. Aided by the Hunters' propensity for supplying, they normally supply through the majority of the event deck during a game, and they strangle Dracula's ability to play by efficiently clearing the trail and effectively positioning and using their movement very well. Dracula, on the other hand, has few resources to disrupt the Hunter meta, as of now, and often has to resort to risky plays to avoid a slow death later on in the game. While I'm of the opinion that some Dracula players do not sufficiently respect the Hunter's capabilities, as a player but also as a faction. There is no doubt from just playing in and watching tournament games that some games against a highly experienced hunter, it can just feel like Dracula's having to push a heavy boulder up a hill, and it's just almost impossible to win. Okay. So, let's move on to a different topic. How does Dracula win or lose? Now, and the hunters, by extension. So a way we can do this is by looking at our tiebreaker mechanic that we use for tournament league rankings to separate players who have the same number of wins, and it's called the influence damage score, or IDS. Think of it like goal difference or points difference in football or basketball, respectively. It is a way to somewhat quantify the margin of victory using Dracula's influence and Dracula's final health in the calculation. Two key aspects of the game which the players are already acutely aware of and are tracking. The calculation is very simple. To calculate the Dracula player's IDS at the end of the game, you simply take the final influence value that Dracula has achieved minus the ending amount of damage taken. So that's the same as 15 minus Dracula's starting health. Oh, sorry. Final health. 15 is Dracula's starting health minus Dracula's final health. The Hunter's score is then simply whatever the Dracula player's IDS is times by -1. During, or maybe after the first tournament, I realized there was a flaw in this calculation in that the maximum influence Dracula can achieve is 13. So there is a scenario in which Dracula can win but still have negative IDS, and that didn't seem very fair. Therefore, for the second tournament and thereafter, the calculation has included an additional value, this X. This modifier has a value of 2 if Dracula wins the game in any time frame or loses inside of the 4th week. Otherwise, the value is 0. So therefore, it doesn't matter now from now on, the winning player always has a positive IDS value. And Dracula's not disadvantaged by only gaining 13 influence, but potentially losing, 14 health to win. This system isn't perfect at assessing the margin of victory, as often there will be a close and tactical game, but the Dracula player is just unable to obtain a substantial amount of influence. I'm sure there are alternative point systems that we could come up with, but this system is valued for its simplicity. It doesn't require the players involved to track a huge amount of information during the game, which then distracts them from the game itself, and the values required for this calculation can be easily double-checked or discussed if there is a discrepancy in the reporting of the result. So, with that in mind, let's look at the data. So on this graph, what I've done is I've plotted all the IDS values achieved for Dracula on the x-axis. So if it's a positive value, it's a Dracula victory, negative value, Dracula defeat. And then the number of games with that result on the y-axis. This data comes from all of the tournaments. So what I've done is I've manually adjusted all the Dracula victories from the first tournament to have the additional 2-point modifier. But I cannot do the same for the Dracula defeats because there was no information reported at the time about when the game concluded. So I've had to leave them as they are. So therefore there are not as many -1 or -2 IDS results, but I don't think it changes the story too much. I did originally have all the tournament contributions in different colors, but it looked really messy. So I've just used one color, but the contribution from each tournament is in date order, from the oldest at the bottom to the most recent at the top, and the black lines on each bar show you, where one tournament starts and the other one ends. The one thing we can see straight away is that there's a lot less variance on the side for Dracula victories, which to me is rather surprising. I had assumed that there would be a high proportion of Dracula victories at low IDS, in other words, Dracula finishing on low health, because he has to expend health through sea travel and potentially fighting and also using wolf form to escape effectively. I was even more surprised that the most common Dracula victory, albeit not by much, is an IDS value of 15, which means Dracula finished the game on full health. I'm going to presume that this is not common against experienced hunters, but for my sake, I'm not going to repeat this graph for looking at players of different win rates. This video has been overdue long enough. The side with negative IDS values, so therefore hunter victories, Dracula defeats, has a lot more variance, with Dracula losing with more specific IDS values. the value of -15 is the most common by quite a distance. So that means Dracula loses with no influence obtained at all. There are a lot of games ending on middling amounts on IDS. You can do the calculations yourself at home to try and work out what combination of influence sources would lead to these values. The number of small negative IDS values shows that there are few games that end with Dracula losing, but on a high amount of influence, which is perhaps not surprising, as you need two very equally matched players to achieve this. But it's a bit disappointing. We want to see as many games in this sort of region as possible. So, just in case the Immortal update had an impact on how games played out, I went the wrong way. Derp. Here's the same graph, but for the 4 tournaments after the update only. While the frequency of certain results has risen and fallen, the general shape of the two sides of the graph haven't changed very much. So I'm not gonna, read into this too much. So, here are the average values of IDS for Dracula victories and defeats across all the longer form tournaments. We must remember that the League of Dracula 2022 average for Dracula defeats is probably a bit closer to the other values in reality, but due to the missing 2 points for the Dracula players who lost after week 3, the fact that wasn't included, we have to go with this number. Given the spread of IDS values, obviously it can range between 1 and 15 or -1 and -15. The difference in the average values for Dracula victories and Dracula defeats is not statistically significant. But the idea that Dracula victories would be lower in IDS due to Dracula using his health as a resource to gain more influence in fights or to use sea travel, wolf form to escape the hunters is not a surprise. I just thought Draculas would have to spend more health to win, so an average IDS value this high, at least for me, was a pleasant surprise. Now, do you know what I said earlier about what the graph would look like for higher skilled players, and that I'd have to leave it be because I wouldn't have time to run that analysis? Well, once an idea goes into my brain, I can't let it lie. So here is the same graph for all tournaments except New Blood and the 2 team-based tournaments for games involving hunters who, within that tournament, had a win rate of above 50%. The general shapes of the graphs look somewhat similar. At a glance, the values that are noticeably lower than the previous ones are for -9 and -10 IDS. Seemingly, there are combinations of influence that are not obtained against more skilled hunters. And in addition, the number of games ending in a positive 15 IDS victory for Dracula has decreased considerably, which is perhaps not a surprise. So now, if we look at the average IDS values for this graph that I've just done and compared it to the ones, the average values for the games involving all players, we can see that the value for Dracula defeats is more or less the same, but the average for Dracula victories has dropped significantly. I will say not statistically significant. I say, there's a clear decrease, but statistically speaking, it's not significant. But anyway, hopefully that makes sense. But against more skilled hunters, in order to win, Dracula has to spend more health to do so, so this makes perfect sense to me. But I'm a little bit surprised that the Dracula defeats average is not higher. When I say higher, I mean a more negative value. Anyway, this is what happens when I start deviating off my script. Right. So the next 2 slides, or a couple slides, was just me attempting to look at IDS in a slightly different way and how they change between examining all games and only those involving high win rate hunters. But instead of using the bar graphs, I was using pie charts because I thought it'd make it easier for me to look at. So also to make it easier to look at, I've grouped up the IDS results into 3 groups. So you've got large IDS between 11 and 15, middling IDS between 6 and 10, and then small IDS between 1 and 5. This is just arbitrary. You can do it however you want. When looking at the Dracula victories, the pie charts are split into almost equal thirds between the three equally sized IDS groups. Although there is an increase in the number of small IDS values, that's what this green portion is here on the left-hand side of the pie charts. There's an increase in this portion for games involving higher win rate hunters, which makes sense. And then if we look at the Dracula defeats, the pie charts look exactly the same. Oh, my percentage is missing. Oh, well, you can do the maths what that missing percentage is, but they're pretty much the same. The two charts are exactly the same. So while these graphs are simple to look at, or say pie charts are simple to look at, there's clearly some hidden detail within them. As we already know, the average IDS for Dracula victories decreased by almost 2 when comparing all games to games involving highway hunters. All the games with, say, a result of 14 or 15 IDS could shift to, say, 11 or 12 IDS, and you'd see no difference in these pie charts. So it's like the win rate, the devil's in the details. So even though I wanted to do this to simplify everything, it actually hid some of the changes. So maybe this wasn't a good idea, but I wanted to show it anyway. So because of this, I was trying to think of another way at comparing IDS values. So I opted to look at the change of IDS values as a percentage of all the games played. So, for example, for Dracula victories, when looking at all games involving all players, the positive 15 IDS result for Dracula contributes 9.5 more or less percent of, or accounts for 9.5% of all the Dracula victories that we've had. But if we only consider games in which the hunters have above 50% win rate, then this result only contributes 4.6-ish percent, or accounts for 4.6% of all the Dracula victories. So the difference between them, the difference in their contribution, is minus 4.9%. So what I did was I did this same calculation for all of the possible IDS values and plotted it all on a bar graph that looks like this. So for each specific IDS value, if the bar for it is sitting above 0, then it means it is more common for games involving high win rate hunters. If it's below 0%, then it means it is less common for games involving high win rate hunters. So the biggest change we can see is for the 15, positive 15 IDS result, which we saw from the previous graphs as well, has dropped by the most of all the other results. But for some reason, the positive 14 and 13 IDS results are actually a bit more common, which for me is a bit unexpected, but maybe they would be 15 IDS results if it were a game involving a lesser skilled hunter. I'm not sure. The other thing of note on the Dracula victory side is that the low IDS results, indicating very close games in which Dracula finishes with little health, are higher for games involving high win rate hunters, which for me is to be expected. So I'm really surprised that we didn't see that on the pie charts I just showed previously. Not quite sure what's going on. But anyway, it is interesting though that the change is not replicated on the Dracula defeat side. You'd expect, the same, that these values ranging between -5 and -1 IDS to be more common when you have games against a high skilled hunter. Maybe the hunters are just winning those games instead of losing them, perhaps. Considering the middling IDS values, there's an interesting result going on here where the results ranging from -6 to -8 are more common, but the ones from -9 to -12 are less common. I don't really know what's going on here. I don't think these two things are necessarily related with each other. It's just maybe coincidence. Instinctively, it makes little sense as to why, if they were related, it makes little sense to me why hunters with high win rate would be giving up more influence to Dracula. One thing, though, maybe to consider is high win rate hunters are more likely to progress to later stages of the tournaments, in which then they will, by default, play against more skilled Dracula players, who are then able to obtain more influence despite losing. I'm not quite sure. I don't really know what's going on here. Maybe those games, they're not sufficient of those types of games to influence this. I don't really know, to be honest. Somebody in the comments who's smarter than me will probably know the answer. The highest negative IDS values, indicating the heaviest margin of defeat for Dracula, all increase, showing that skilled hunters are able to restrict Dracula's ability to gain influence. No surprise to anybody, I don't think. Phew, okay. You can tell, I got a bit obsessed over IDS, maybe a bit too obsessed. Let's move on to another topic. Right. Let's find out. I don't know why it's going. Oh, yes, that's the right slide. Okay. Let's find out when games end. So, coming back to this IDS calculation that I showed you earlier, and the inclusion of the modifier term, it's actually very easy for us to find out all the games in which Dracula loses either before the beginning of week 4 or after week 4. And here is the data. So we have to exclude the League of 2022 because, as I said before, the modifier term was not part of the IDS calculation back then. So across these 422 Dracula defeats, 73%-ish of them were within the first 3 weeks of the game. And this value has been pretty consistent across all the tournaments, except Duos and Dark Halls. I don't know what's going on there. Clearly something wacky was happening with that house rule. We'll go on to that later. And yeah, by extension, if it's 73% defeats within the first 3 weeks, then 27% after week 4, or the beginning of week 4, I should say. So, is Dracula struggling to reach the 4th week? The data seems to say so. So, we now have a rough idea of when Dracula loses, but we don't know if there's a more frequent day that Dracula loses, and from this data we know nothing about Dracula victories. Now, fortunately, in some of the tournaments, we actually asked the players to, as part of their post-game report, to write down the day in which the game ended. So let's see if that tells us anything. So here's the graph from the most recent tournament. So the different days of the game along the x-axis, and the number of games that finished on that day on the y-axis. Right, and it's split into Hunter victories in grey, Dracula victories in red, or left-hand side for Hunters, right-hand side for Dracula, if you prefer. From the Hunter perspective, they are far more likely to win early on, around days 7 to 13. I mean, when I say more likely, I mean not compared to later, but compared to Dracula. Hopefully that was clear. But there's also a peak for the Hunters winning around late week 3, and also into week 4 a little bit. For Dracula, it's quite clear that a lot of the victories for Dracula come between days 23 and 25, so the middle of the 4th week very much dominates this graph. And just these 3 days alone account for 42% of all the Dracula victories. So, just in case this tournament was an outlier, here's the same graph for 2024. Same idea, but there's actually even more preference for Dracula winning in the 4th week compared to the Hunters in this tournament and beyond. I want to give credit to this lone Hunter who won a game that lasted 29 days. Very impressive. Well done to that player. If you know who you are, well done. So, if we combine the results from these two graphs, and then also, just to make it a little bit easier, if we group the days into blocks of 3, it looks like this. This is slightly similar to look at, but it shows off the difference between the two factions really well. The Hunters have a greater spread of results, but they peak at the end of the 3rd week, whereas Dracula has a clear peak, midway through week 4. So from this, it's quite clear that Dracula really does rely on his Fury of Dracula influence ability/points in order to gain enough influence to win. So the other thing to point out is through the way the tournaments are structured and also the IDS calculations, the Hunter players are incentivized to try to win before week 4 because then they give up less influence and then thus IDS, so they'll rank higher in the league. While Dracula players seem to struggle to get enough influence to win prior to week 3. As such, the crucial moment in games often comes at the end of week 3 when the Hunter player pulls the trigger, if possible, in the hope to keep Dracula's influence at a minimum. At that point, too, they should have dealt with the trail at such a pace that there are a few or maybe no encounters to deal with and are well positioned and well equipped to capitalize on any mispositioning by Dracula. So, to conclude this section, if we include data from the League of Dracula 2023 and the Immortal Invitational, we have even more data describing in which week each game concluded, rather than a specific day. From these 557 games, we can see that just under half of the games ended in the 4th week, 30% or so in the 3rd week, and then about 20% in the 2nd week, and then a smattering of games, let's say, in week 1. If we then look at the data for only Hunter victories, we can see that the biggest slice of the pie comes from week 3 rather than week 4. Just under half of the games, in fact. And then you got a fairly even split between week 2 and week 4. I haven't personally watched a huge number of games ending in week 2, so to have slightly more games ending in Hunter victory in week 2 than week 4 was surprising to me. But the data doesn't care about my opinions. For Dracula, however, there's a very different result. A whopping 68%, over 2/3 of all of the games, ended in week 4, with 12% in week 2, 20% in week 3, and then no Draculas were able to win in week 1. That would be impressive. You'd have to. There is an achievement for that, but it hasn't been done yet, at least not in the tournaments. This really goes to show how critical the Fury of Dracula points are for Dracula's success, and how hard it is to accumulate sufficient influence from other sources to win. Good. Okay, moving on to another topic. How is Dracula and his trail revealed? Now, this might ring a bell for some of you, as I've already produced an award-winning strategy guide about the various events that help you find Dracula's trail. And I included some of the data in here, but I've also updated it to include the League of Dracula 2023 and the Immortal Invitational, not just the League of 2024. And here's the graph. So if we take into account all the different ways that the hunters can find any sort of aspect of Dracula's trail or current location, we can see that in 58% of the games, newspaper reports was the critical first event or interaction that revealed any aspect of Dracula's trail. If you're not aware, the probability of drawing one of the 3 newspaper reports by Saturday dawn, so that's when Dracula's first encounter, not location, but first location with an encounter, slides to the 5th space of the trail, assuming that the hunters are only day supplying, is 61%. So this data matches with that pretty well and does not exceed it, which I think is important to know. Next biggest contribution is from hired scouts. Of course, that doesn't rule out the fact that newspaper reports could have also been drawn in the first week. We're only concerned with the first card or interaction that causes Dracula's trail to be revealed. Hired scouts also being quite successful is probably due to the fact that there's the meta based upon hunter starting positions, and there'll be certain parts of the board which will be more favoured for Dracula to start in. And then you've got the remaining, what would that be? The remaining, say, 25%-ish of the pie. You got contributions from all the other ways that Dracula's trail could be revealed. If you want to find out more about all of these, do go back and watch that video. Okay. Next topic. Do vampires even mature? Right, let's play a guessing game here. I'll give you a second, or you can pause the video if you want, to guess the average number of vampires that mature per game. And it doesn't have to be a whole number, by the way. Or if you want to make it easier, if you were to watch 10 random games, how many vampires would you see mature in total across those 10 games? I'll give you a second to consider. Right, let's see who is correct. So looking at the data from the League of Dracula tournaments from 2023, 2024, and the Immortal Invitational. 325 vampires survived for a week on the trail and matured. That equates to an average of 0.9 more or less vampires per game, or, in other words, 9 vampire matures across 10 games. I'd love to know what you guessed, but I really didn't believe the value would be that high. And this number is also fairly consistent between the 3 tournaments, which took place also either side of the Immortal update. So, that's promising. However, like a lot of headline figures, this value doesn't tell the whole story. If we look at this pie chart, 29% of games saw no vampire matures. Around 1/2 of the games had 1 vampire maturing, and then just under 20% had 2 vampires mature, and then we had 1% of games had 3 vampire matures. So even though the average is 0.9 vampires per game, around 3 in every 10 games saw no vampire matures at all. Now, if we look at the same data, but only for games involving hunters with above a 65% win rate, I'm not quite sure why I chose 65% here and 50% earlier, but that's what you get for doing analysis over a long period of time, I suppose. That's my defense anyway. The average number of vampire matures fell to around 7 vampires in every 10 games, and an increase in the number of games with no vampire matures to 40%, and also a clear reduction in the number of games with 2 or more vampires maturing. And it's not really a surprise that skilled hunters are good at stopping vampire matures or keeping them to a minimum, but it's nice to have the numbers to back it up. Right, in a similar vein, how often do hunter characters die, or are defeated, if we want to use the game terminology? Well, perhaps no surprise to anybody, or maybe let us know down in the comments if that's the case. The number of hunter deaths per game, on average, is lower than vampire matures. While some Dracula players are very skillful at defending their vampires, or perhaps receive a bit of luck to get one to mature in week 1 because hunters don't draw newspaper reports or don't have sufficient movement to get to the first location, it is seemingly much more difficult to get hunters in a position that they can be killed off. A massive 62% of games saw no hunter deaths at all, and then only around 10% of the games saw more than 1 hunter death. When I say more than 1 hunter death, it could be the same hunter twice, because obviously hunters that are defeated get revived during the game. Repeating these calculations, but for games involving hunter players with above a 65% win rate, saw the number of hunter deaths fall by around 60%. And there are more than 80% of games saw no hunter death at all. And there's no game that saw more than 1 hunter death either. Again, it's no real surprise that top hunters are good at keeping their characters alive, but it goes to show how rare an occurrence they actually are at the top level. And also how maybe they're a key to success. If you're a budding hunter player out there and you're struggling to win, ask yourself, how many times are my hunters dying? And if you can get this number as low as possible, then you're on the path to success, hopefully. Right. Okay, on to perhaps the most controversial topic, Consecrated Ground. It's the one card that causes the most discussion in terms of whether it is broken, overpowered, this insta-win card, and how on earth it should be changed to make it fairer. More on that in the follow-up video. So we started asking participants about it to see if the data disagreed with our feelings. We asked players to select one of 3 options. The hunters possessed and used Consecrated Ground, or we'll call it CG from now on. That's our in-community nickname for it. So that's one option. The hunters possessed and used CG. or the hunters had CG but didn't use it, or the hunters didn't have CG at all. So looking first at the prompts themselves, the hunters possess CG in almost 53% of games, which to me actually gives a rough idea of how much of the event deck is being supplied on average, as any single copy card is as likely to be drawn as any other. I'm surprised that the possessed but didn't play CG value is so high, as it is. But that might be me underestimating how much CG is valued by other players, especially new players who come into the community and have got a lot of other things on their plate to worry about. Before I reveal the win rates, let's play another guessing game, shall we? What do you think is the win rate for Hunters and Dracula when CG is played? I'll give you a second, or feel free to pause the video to guess. But do guess. It's an order. Alright, hopefully that's giving you enough time to think. So, I can reveal that the win rate was 53% in the Hunter's favour, which I am sure is way lower than most of you predicted. Comment down below if that's not the case. Okay, let's do the reverse. Guess, what do you think are the win rates for the Hunters and for Dracula when the Hunters do not have CG? What do you think? Dracula's completely dominant and wins almost all the games? No! Dracula has the win rate advantage, but not by much. Right, just filling in this table completely. The one thing that did surprise me, though, was that when the Hunters had CG but didn't play it, we actually saw a huge win rate in favour of Dracula. My guess would be that a lot of these games would involve less experienced players who perhaps do not know yet the optimal moment to play CG or its full potential. Or the card... Yeah, so the card doesn't get used. But if you have an alternative theory, post it down below. Okay, so those results might have caught us all off guard a little bit. Maybe Consecrated Ground isn't the insta-win we thought all along. Right. Let's look at the same prompts, but for games involving Hunters with more than 65% win rate. Firstly, we can see that the rate at which CG was drawn increased to almost 59% compared to 53%. This makes complete sense. More skilled hunters and more experienced hunters are more likely to find opportunities to supply, so they get more events. And it's more likely to draw Consecrated Ground. Now, the win rates will obviously be skewed here because the hunters have the advantage anyway, because it's involving hunters with more than 65% win rate. But to how much of an extent does Consecrated Ground help? Right. Surprisingly, the hunter win rate is higher when they didn't have CG compared to when they played CG. Dracula, again, has the win rate advantage for when hunters have CG but chose not to play it. I know this is a very small number of games, by the way. But my guess would be that CG was either drawn too late to be relevant, or they faced a Dracula who's in such formidable form, and the hunters were so weak that CG wasn't relevant in the game. Okay, these numbers are extremely interesting to me. My summary about Consecrated Ground is it in itself is not overpowered, but in the right hands it can be devastating. But then again, based upon these stats, that can be said for almost all the other events in the event deck too. We'll discuss Consecrated Ground in detail in the follow-up video. Okay, on to the last topic. Dark Call. Right, when the Immortal update was implemented, we were able to add a house rule, originally suggested in a video a long time ago by Quincy Morris, if I recall correctly. The house rule is in addition to its normal effect. Dark Call allows Dracula to draw the top card of the event deck. If it is a Dracula card, it is kept. This was done as a possible way for Dracula to obtain more events, since Hoax Matures are pretty uncommon, and Night Supplies are, well, in short supply. the house rule was applied to all games of the Jewels and Dark Halls tournament, hence the name, and Dark Hall was actually used in 3/4 of the games. People were definitely very keen to try it out. Now, if I scroll through the win rates for both factions, depending on how many times Dark Hall was used, you can see that the Hunters actually had a higher win rate, except for when Dark Hall was activated twice. I don't really understand the huge swing in win rate between 1 and 2 uses of Dark Hall. I guess if Dracula activates it more, he's more likely to get an event that is worthwhile having in that moment, whereas one use could be a bit of a coin flip. And even though Dracula is likely gaining an event with this card, he's still taking damage and not placing an encounter to do so, so it has drawbacks. Now, some of you might be saying, but Scott Sword, Dracula players might have just used Dark Call to discard Hunter events or to stay in place. They weren't actually using it to try to gain events. Well, fortunately, we can answer this question because we also have data on how many Dracula cards were obtained by using Dark Call. And this is the data from it. So you can see that from this slightly different perspective of thinking about the usage of Dark Call, the picture doesn't really change anymore. It doesn't change very much. So there you go. So I'm glad that this house rule didn't break the game per se, while providing a little bit more variety and especially highlighting, the Dracula cards that don't normally get a huge amount of exposure. Although I am still personally very salty as my experiences as exclusively a Hunter player during this tournament against this rule was one of woe and insane draws from the Dracula players. Clearly my experience was a little bit of an outlier. I feel there are other ways we can get more Dracula events into the game, but I'll save that one for the next video as well. We didn't implement this house rule into the most recent League of Dracula tournament, but I am open to including it in other tournaments down the line, depending on what other house rules can be implemented and what the rest of the community want to do. So, to wrap up this rather long video, which actually wasn't as long as I thought it would, so that's good. Here's a summary. We've gained a lot of knowledge of how the overall win rate hides the win rates of players with more or less experience and skill with each role, and also the disparity between the two different factions. It is something we had expected, but it's great to have the data to back it up now. We've also gained an insight into how Hunters win and lose, and also Draculas win and lose, in terms of IDS and also in terms of time. We saw some perhaps unexpected stats, such as the number of vampires that mature and the win rate for the Hunters when Consecrated Ground is in play. But it goes to show how good skilled Hunter players are at utilising all the cards they have to their advantage, as well as minimising harm done to them. Especially with Hunter deaths, as this can be controlled a lot more than Vampire matures, especially early ones. To end this video, I'd like to open up a conversation about what type of stats we'd hopefully like to see be collected in the future. I know for one that I would love to know the exact proportion of Dracula's influence obtained by all the various sources, and also the potential timing of such influence. Maybe that one's not so important, but still. I'd also like to know the distributions of Dracula's starting positions across the map. I have a feeling, at least from the games I've watched, that Dracula has a strong tendency to start in the eastern portion of the map, so Austro-Hungaria and Baltica. But again, maybe the data might prove me wrong on that. It'd also be really cool if we could somehow track all of Dracula's moves and see the most common and least common cities visited, most common wolf form locations, or wolf form like city combinations with wolf form. The number of sea spaces covered per game, specific sea routes, which ones are the most common. Even though we have probably a good idea, especially like for example leaving from the Ionian Sea, we have an idea of Dracula's far more likely to go Tyrinian. But then again, with a follow-up video, with a couple of maybe house rule changes, we might see a bit of diversity in this. I can just imagine having the game map, like you can see here on the screen, which somehow has a black dashed line on it from one of my graphs. I hadn't even noticed that. I'm not redoing this whole video for that. You can have to just look at that. But I can just imagine looking at the game map like this and having almost like a heat map overlaid with it, which shows, where Dracula goes and the most common city connections being, bolder in color or whatever. I guess the same could be done for the hunters, but the heat maps will be very much dominated from them sitting still in the first week. So maybe it won't be as relevant. It would also be cool if we could count the uses of all the various event cards and then also rank them by win rate. Would this really align with how we see different cards in our tier list discussions? How skill dependent is each card? Might be a bit tricky because there are some cards which obviously have multiple copies. So you would expect to see them more often. Not written here, I don't think. But I'd also like to know the rate of maturation of the first encounter placed. How often does the first encounter? Because we know that newspaper reports is the most common trail revealing card. But it doesn't tell us anything about how often Dracula still manages to mature that first encounter anyway, if he chooses to mature it, because obviously Dracula could layer it to create a super layer that he'll return to later. Or maybe there's an encounter that's not worth maturing in the first place. It'd be really cool to know the rate of maturation of the first encounter placed, and also what cards are the most likely to be placed early in the game, which ones are most likely to be played later in the game, and so on. I know we have some ideas, but it'd be kind of cool to see it. As I said, like a lot of things in this video, we have a good idea of certain aspects of the game, but it's great to have the data to back it up, or maybe to prove us wrong. And yeah, also the number of supply actions, we can kind of calculate that for the number of times Consecrated Ground gets drawn, but still. It'd be really cool if we could... I guess we could have done it with the Consecrated Ground. No, we wouldn't be able to. No, it'd be really cool if we could track number of supply actions with win rate. I would expect an upward curve, but I wonder if there'd be any outliers. How many outliers there'd be off that curve, and also then would there be like a plateau over time? It'd be kind of interesting to look at that. So yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of stuff that you'd like to know too. So feel free to post them in the comments. This was just me at the end of this, whole process, just trying to think of things I'd be interested in. Not really thinking about how I would use the information per se. But yeah, feel free to leave suggestions down below. This brings me on to another important topic, which is I know some of the information I've mentioned in the previous slide is already available to us, but manually counting it or manually inputting it from the post-match screen as it currently stands into a post-game form will be extremely time-consuming for either the players or for admin or for both. It'd be great if after each game we can get some sort of file that contains all the necessary stat information that we would like, that we can then export from the game and send it to admin for post-game processing or analysis. In addition, I'd love for there to be a way for us to automate the data processing even more, using maybe some sort of bots or macro that we can link to Discord or through Excel or something. I know the Wingspan community, another digital board game community, has something like this. I know their game is a bit different, but they're able to take a screenshot of the post game screen scoreboard and just pop it to Discord, and then the bot does everything. It's able to update the league rankings and stuff. I know our game's a little bit different. And also their community is orders of magnitude larger than ours. They have probably, over 100 people competing in every tournament, whereas we've only got about 20 at this stage. So it's more justifiable for them to have it. But I do know there are people who've collected a lot of stats on Wingspan, but I don't know where, how these stats have been done, especially if they're from the physical board game. They must all be inputted manually. But anyway, at the moment we're just operating off Excel spreadsheets and stuff, and having to look at the report, the game, post-game reports that the players individually submit through Google Forms. It'd be really cool if we could do a way where we could link it to Discord. Maybe only one of the players has to fill it in, and then the opponent will be able to see it inside like a Discord channel and be able to verify it. If they see something that doesn't look right, they can tell us. But just having a file that could be taken out and sent directly to us, which is, and then somehow if we could process it on our end automatically, that would just make life so much easier. But this is going beyond my know-how and expertise. So if there's anybody out there who is kind of into this sort of stuff and knows of a way that could be done, feel free to get in touch with us. I guess with that, really, I'd like to wish you all, firstly, a massive thank you for watching and making it to the end of this video. I hope it was informative. Apologies for the slight stumbling over my words and stuff. I do have a script, but at times I was kind of ignoring it. And also, I am a bit tired. Life with full-time job and a young baby doesn't allow for a lot of quality time to do this sort of thing at tip-top energy. So, thank you for bearing with me. I don't normally pander for likes, but as I said, this video did take me a while to make, with me writing scripts during my lunch breaks at work and also doing analysis late at night. Once my baby daughter finally decided to fall asleep. So, yeah, this is also a late night recording. So, if you did enjoy, please feel free to leave a like. And as I said, all comments would be much appreciated. A massive heartfelt thanks as well to all the members of the Fury of Dracula community who have participated in the tournaments, whether that's just in one of them or in all of them. Your commitment and enthusiasm to the game and positive attitude to these events run completely voluntarily have made it all worthwhile. The fact we are such a small community but a very dedicated community, with all our tournaments not exceeding more than 20 participants more or less, but we've reached this fantastic milestone of 1,000 tournament games is completely astonishing. It goes beyond my wildest dreams of when I had the silly idea to run the tournament for the very first time, almost 4 years ago now. So thanks for that, and here's to the next 1,000 games, I hope. A huge shout out to Nomad for their engagement with us over the years, despite obviously they've got a clear need to be fully invested with other projects that will sustain their company all, well into the future. I hope this video has given you, people at Nomad, food for thought, especially with the 2-year anniversary of the Immortal update fast approaching. We are always very much available to chat, either privately or with the community as a whole, about the topics raised in this video, whether it's my ideas or the ideas of everybody else. And also, that being said, for everybody else, if you're watching this and you're interested in what we do, please do join the Discord communities, and the links are in the description. We're always looking out for new players, either for friendly games or for tournament participation, especially if we want to collect more stats. I'm just saying, the more people we have in the tournaments, the quicker we get the stats. But no, we want to sustain the community and interest in the game for as long as possible. And even if you don't want to play the game too much, doesn't matter. Join anyway, because we have plenty of memes over there. And you can also watch the live streams of the tournament games. So, I think that's it from me. I'll see you in the follow-up video that will be out, because this video is officially longer than an hour long. So, assuming you haven't watched this in ×2 speed, the follow-up video is now on YouTube. So, I guess I'll see you over there. And otherwise, take care, everybody. Thank you for watching. And yeah, see you in another Fury of Dracula video very soon. Bye bye.